Hi, I'm Robert Veel from Limelight Arts Travel, and in this online talk, I'm going to follow the money as we explore the explosion of Venice's remarkable maritime commercial empire. If you're visiting the city of Venice, you can see evidence of commercial activity in Venice all over the city, but there are two areas in particular that I think you should focus on. The first is a place that almost everybody who comes to Venice for the first time and then on subsequent visits passes through, and that's the Rialto area. There's a good reason for that. It's one of the major crossings of the Grand Canal, as you can see with the wonderful 1577 Rialto Bridge. But on either side of the bridge, today it's taken over with tourist infrastructure, restaurants and bars and things like that. But at the time, it was a bustling international trading place, which had banks, financiers, traders, boats coming up, wharves, customs officials, people from all over the world. It still architecturally retains some of those features and is well worth looking at. Today in the talk, we'll be looking at the basis for all of that activity around the Rialto area. The second major pole of the city is in a much more far-flung part of the city, and that's out towards the eastern side. And this is the Arsenale, or the shipyards of Venice, an incredible place that employed some 10,000 people in one of the world's first production lines. Now, I'm not going to be talking about shipping and the sea in this particular talk. It's an important part of understanding Venice's commerce and Venice's trading empire, but I'm going to give a separate talk on that topic. In this talk, we're going to be talking about the origins of trade and the nature of trade and the extent of the Venetian trading empire. Even if you love beautiful art and architecture and the lagoon views, and that's your reason for coming to the city, understanding the commerce is important to understand the culture, because it's through the commerce that all of the interaction with other parts of the world and all of the diverse influences which go to make Venice such a distinctive and unique place come from. So follow the money with me. A little known and little explored fact of Venice's early history is that it wasn't a place that undertook trade missions to the east, and as it later did, had trading stations all through the Black Sea and the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, Venice's origins as a trading state go back quite a lot further. They go back to the dying days, if you like, of the Roman Empire. And it wasn't the sea trade that the Venetians became proficient with, it was the river trade. And that was the trade of luxury goods, which had come from the east on Byzantine ships, were transported, I should say, to Venetian barges and other vessels on the lagoon at the various wharves there, and then transported, often in convoys, 400 kilometers up the Po River through northern Italy, as far away as Pavia, which you can see on the map here, which was the capital of the Lombard kingdom. At the same time as bringing imported goods from the east, the Venetians also produced their own products, such as dried fish and, of course, salt from the lagoon. Just to the north, they also had timber, which was used in construction and in shipbuilding in the forests of what we know as the Dolomites today. And so the timber was felled and was floated down the river to the Venetian lagoon, where it could be used there. Further up in the area around Lombardy that we know today, around Milan and the city of Pavia, of course, was where grain was grown. And very early on, from the 7th and the 8th century, the Venetians were known for the unusual habit that they had of buying grain. This is something that nobody else did, but the Venetians living on a lagoon couldn't really grow large quantities of grain. So they often traded the luxury goods, the fish and the salt for grain and other materials. In these early centuries, the Venetians learn a couple of important things. They learn to travel in convoys because they're traveling through enemy lands. Northern Italy was controlled firstly at this time by the Lombards, a group who'd come from across the Alps, and later by the Franks or the Carolingians after the 800s. They were both Venice's enemies, and so Venice had to be very careful, and so they sent out their goods in convoys. They wanted to make sure that the ships didn't sink, so they had things like a load line or a plimsoll line, which kept the ship safe. They instigated all sorts of marine laws, the first marine laws of Venice, which supervised the movement of goods, and they learnt some of their famous diplomatic skills in doing business with the enemy in these early centuries. Now, if you visit the Venetian lagoon today, you still see all sorts of lagoon and river boats. The zattere, which are the large barges which brought goods up and down the river, the sandalo, which was the lagoon boat, and various other small, generally flat-bottom boats, of course, because it was a very shallow lagoon, and the river was also shallow. So those early forays and the early skills, we don't really know very much about them, but they were actually up and down the river. But Venice, importantly, as it grows, became the centre, and a really well-located centre for what became an enormous web of resource exchange, which is, of course, what underpins any kind of commercial entity or commercial empire. And so it's important, firstly, to consider what were some of those things. So let's go to the top right, for example, where we can see horses. Now, Anatolia, particularly, and the area that we call the Balkans today, it was and the Black Sea and Central Asia, horses, silk goods, of course, coming from China and the East. Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire in the East, or the Byzantine Empire as it came to become known. And of course, as sort of the greatest city, greater than any city in Western Europe at the time, it was a centre for the production and the consumption of luxury goods. So we had spices coming from the Eastern world, luxury cloths, including the purple cloth, which was supposedly to be worn only by the emperor, ornaments, beautiful jewellery, goldsmithing, things which were appealing to that very small slither of European society which could still afford them. Looking across, though, at the Adriatic and the area immediately around Venice, we see other key important resources. I've already mentioned timber in the forests to the north. The proximity of that timber to Venice on the sea was an important ingredient in the success of its shipbuilding. And remember that many other places in the Mediterranean, particularly on the southern shores of the Mediterranean in North Africa, had very little timber. The Romans had deforested Sicily and other places during the period of the Roman Empire. So this was a valuable, critical resource. Fish, of course, from the Adriatic, which could either be consumed fresh on the spot or salted using the salt from the Venetian lagoon. The salt pans in the lagoon was also a commodity that was traded. It was a useful kind of portable food for maritime trade, also kept and provided protein to people all throughout the Mediterranean basin and beyond. If you travelled through southern Italy, through Puglia, you'll know that there is kilometre after kilometre of olive trees. This is a great place for growing olive oil, which was used not just in cooking and on your salads, but was a fundamental ingredient in all sorts of manufacturing, including soap, for example, that came from that particular area. The rivers of northern Italy, the rivers which flow into the lagoon, also provided lime and sand, which could be used for building. And in fact, sand, people who moved sand around are commemorated in the names of many of the squares in Venice. And of course, as I've already mentioned, grain, which was grown on the Po plain and could be consumed not just by the Venetians, but by other groups of people who lived in less amenable terrains to that kind of growing. The one resource which is there on the map in red, which I'm sure you've seen already, which I haven't talked about, is slaves. And again, rather like the river trade, it's Venice's early human commodities in the form of slaves, which is often not much mentioned in the histories. But in fact, the word slave is connected very much to Venice's history and the geography. Before the 11th century, the people who lived in what we would call Yugoslavia in the Balkans today had not been Christianized, or they were pagan. They were not part of any of the monotheistic religions. They were Slavic people. Schiavoni is the Italians called them, or Esclavonians, as it sometimes comes to us in English. They could be raided, and they were, by Venetian ships. It was okay to do so because they were not Christian, and they could be sold to groups of people, and some of the biggest consumers, in fact, were Muslims. So slaves coming from the Slavic people, and that word coming from Venice's particular economic interest. And so we can see in those early centuries, the 9th to 11th century slave trade shown on this map. And you can see the Venetian lagoon there and Venice's strategic location, so important to its development as a trading entity, and the accessibility of those groups of people. And as you can see with the map going south into the Mediterranean. I need to point out, of course, they were by no means the only slave traders. The Rus, who were the Vikings who had sailed from Scandinavia all through the rivers of Russia right down to the Black Sea and established trading stations, were major slave traders. And you can see the routes across the Caspian and the Black Sea, which were the Rus controlled, and indeed North African merchants then controlling the routes through the Mediterranean and on through the Gulf and the Red Sea and beyond. So an extensive international network through which Venice gained the resources through which it could import goods such as luxury goods from Constantinople, for example. And thus, through timber, through the river, and through the slave trade, did Venice in those early centuries become a place where business could be done, and the Venetians themselves become a society of traders, a society of merchants, which, of course, in this time is the absolute stereotype of the Venetian. And it's that merchant class which rules the city, creates the laws, and gives Venice its absolute later triumph. It's functioning rather in the way perhaps that one of the East India companies, like the Dutch or the British East India companies, were to function in later centuries. It is a corporate state. Its reason for existing was to trade. The government was comprised of merchants, and much of the law making that was taking place, and the warfare, in fact, in which the Venetians engaged in, was oriented towards the expansion and the maintenance and the monopoly of their trading empires. Just quickly, I'm mentioning, I've mentioned before, timber. Another important characteristic which we'll see in Venetian commerce, and something that they learn very early on, is state intervention. So this is very different from perhaps the American free market model. The Venetian state actively participated in commercial activities. It provided warships to protect the convoys. It created the laws which made Venice such a fair place in which to do business. And it did other things with resources, such as this state forest. Up in the hills, Venice had a number of state forests which had different kinds of timber which were used for different parts of a ship. So, for example, there was one forest which specifically grew the timber which was used to make oars for the Venetian galleys and the riverboats. Another, such as the forest at Cansiglio, which you can see in this picture, which was used for the timber for hulls. These were often at an altitude. The Venetians built slides which were used to transport the timber from the altitudes down to the rivers, and then floated the timber down. They tied it together and floated it down with barges. The administrator of the forests was a nobleman who was stationed up there, who supervised and protected the Venetian resources. So very, very different perhaps than the model we've become used to, thanks to American sort of freestyle capitalism. This was very much state or community controlled. After the 11th century, Europe begins to emerge from its Dark Ages slumber, if you like, economically. Pilgrimage and trade began to expand. Nation states begin to form in the north. The German Empire, a confederation of states, France, the Kingdom of France, and the Kingdom of England also emerge at this particular time. Italy, of course, is a fragmented place with city-states in the north, larger kingdoms in the south. The Byzantine world, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the east, with Constantinople as its capital city, has begun to crumble and decline. It's a very slow decline. It takes until the year 1453 when the Ottoman Turks take the city, but it can progressively be felt. And so a vacuum is created, if you like, a commercial and a governance vacuum in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Venetians increasingly fill those spaces. Perhaps for commercial reasons or perhaps for military reasons, the Venetians in these early centuries are not at all interested in a land empire. That only comes later. And if you look at this map, you can see, well, most of the major maritime empires, including the Hansa in the north, the Catalans and the Genoese, but the areas in red on the map show the Venetian trading empire. Yes, they did control land. They controlled the shores of the Adriatic. They controlled the Peloponnese. They controlled Crete, their most important island holding. They controlled the shores of Asia Minor, and they had a very strong presence on ports on the Levant, the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. But those places and the fortresses and the stations existed simply to maintain and facilitate the trade, the movement of goods from east to west and then around Western Europe. And so you can see here again how geographically blessed Venice is, that the Adriatic pops right up to the north. It's the most connected and the most closely connected with northern and central Europe. It also means that if you're coming from the east, you don't have to navigate either through around North Africa or through the Straits of Messina, both of which lengthen the journey and add considerably to the risk. So once Venice expands, of course, control of the Adriatic is going to be the first step. But it slots into what may surprise you today is a remarkably sophisticated trade network. And archaeologists have found a very clear evidence for this. All sorts of goods from all over Western and Eastern Europe end up in very diverse places. So around the Baltic, for example, you get things which are made in Constantinople. Venice, of course, brings together of course, famously luxury goods from the East, but it also imports styles, architectural and decorative styles from the West. So you're going to get Gothic, you're going to get Romanesque style, which comes from Europe, but you're going to get luxury and quality of materials, which is thoroughly Eastern. And these are the things which make up the Venetian style. So the expansion of Venice's maritime empire from the lagoon and the rivers really begins from about 1000 CE onwards. And in fact, we can use that date 1000, that exact date 1000, because this is the year in which a doge, Pietro II Orseolo, leads an expedition to the northern Adriatic, whose purpose is to subdue pirates who have been harassing the Venetian fleet, and indeed he manages to conquer some of those. And you can see just across from Venice at the map, or just across from Ravenna, the Istrian Peninsula. This is the most Venetian culturally part of what we would call Croatia today. And right through to the early 20th century, there were still people there who spoke a variety of the Venetian dialect. So they control that area, and the Venetians Doge begins to style himself as not just being the Doge of Venice, but the Duke of Dalmatia. As the century progresses, as the 11th century progresses, they move down the Adriatic. And by this stage in Sicily and southern Italy, another threat to trade has emerged in the form of the Norman kingdom. So the Normans who come from Normandy in France have conquered southern Italy and made Palermo their capital. They are also threatening Byzantine trade and Byzantine control. In fact, the Normans move across the Adriatic towards what we would call Ragusa and modern-day Albania. And the Byzantines are unable to control them. So it's the Venetians who are called in to try and keep the seaways open. As a result of that, the Venetians gain military control of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their reward from Byzantium is to be given a golden bull, or a trade concession, which means that Venetian merchants do not have to pay the kind of port duties and taxes that other merchants who are moving goods out of Constantinople and into Constantinople have to pay. So Venice immediately has a significant financial advantage over rivals such as Genoa, and maintaining that advantage becomes a key objective of the Venetians. And this is where we really begin to see Venetian diplomatic representation, maintaining good relations with all sorts of people in order, and this was often done by treaties and law rather than by marriage, in order to keep the trade corridors open. The 11th, 12th and 13th century, of course, are the centuries of crusading, where the Pope and the Church, which is also in the ascendant, much in the way that economically Western Europe is, the Church is as well, they begin to see the fall of Jerusalem, the loss of Jerusalem to the Muslims as being a stain on Christianity and the prominence and the rightness of Christianity. There is also a military aspect to this. So the Normans, in conquering Sicily, rid the Muslims from that area, and they create a kind of defensive bulwark around Europe. So too the Crusades are designed not just to reinforce Christianity as the triumphant and dominant religion of Europe, but also to reinforce trade and commercial advantage. And so the Venetians participate willingly in the Crusades, motivated, one has to say, more by commercial advantage than by religious piety. This period culminates in the year 1204, where the Venetians managed to divert the entire Fourth Crusade away from Jerusalem, which is the objective. The conquest of Jerusalem was the objective, of course, of Crusades, to the city of Constantinople, where the Venetians want to exact revenge for the fact that one of the emperors has turned on the Venetian merchants and has stripped away some of those advantages. He's arrested thousands and thousands of Venetians, and the Venetian payback is to conquer the city, to sack the city, and to create themselves as the lords for about 60 or 70 years of the area around Constantinople. You'll see clear evidence of the conquest of Constantinople in your walking around Venice. Many of the great treasures of Venice from this period, the medieval treasures, were actually stolen from Constantinople, and this includes an incredible amount of the external decoration of St. Mark's Basilica. So have a good look around the exterior of St. Mark's Basilica. You'll find all sorts of exotic marble columns, screens, fragments, statues. Almost all of these were stolen from Constantinople in the year 1204. So it's a great trophy cabinet, and it's why St. Mark's is not really coherent as an architectural style. The expansion continues, so the trading stations in the Levant, that is in the Eastern Mediterranean, what we would call Israel, Syria and Lebanon today, those major ports are controlled by the Venetians. The island of Corfu in the Adriatic, very important, in 1386. 1489, the island of Cyprus. And that is the easternmost, we're almost at the Levant there, that is the easternmost of the islands, and it's controlled by the Venetians for more than 100 years before the Ottoman Turks take it back. So the map here then shows, as we get into the 13th century, the expansion and specifically the Venetian routes. So the major cities are on the Adriatic coast: Zara, Zadar today, Ragusa, which we call Dubrovnik today, the major ports on the Adriatic. The route there went down then through the Peloponnese and then either up towards through the Aegean towards Constantinople, and then across Crete onto Rhodes and Cyprus and down to the east. So that conquest really, and the strength of Venetian shipmaking and the careful administration of the Venetian state all create that remarkably resilient and that remarkably productive trade network. And so by the time we get to the year 1500 now, things have changed slightly. In southern Italy, we've now got the crown of Aragon the Aragonese rulers of southern Italy and Sicily. And we have, of course, the Ottoman Turks, who have taken over not just Asia Minor, not just the area on the right, but also the Balkans completely. And again, if you've travelled through the Balkans, you'll see plenty of evidence of the Turkish presence there, notwithstanding the huge loss of Christian lands that come with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1453. The Venetians maintain their maritime republic, and indeed they keep doing business with the Turks, even though they're fighting with them for centuries afterwards. So that's the growth of the network, or the commercial empires, I should say, traded. Just a few notes on this screen, and I'm sorry that this is rather linguistically dense, this particular screen, but just a couple of important features about the Venetian commerce. If you want to know more about this, Frederick Lane has written a very detailed and very highly regarded study in the 1970s called Venice, a Maritime Empire. And this really goes into detail using a lot of economic information to create this. So one of the key things that the Venetians innovate, and remember that the Venetians, it's not just the conquest, the Venetians are famously effective for their trade techniques, and they beg and borrow, innovate and improve as they go. And this is a metaphor for Venice in a way. So if you think about, for example, optics. So optics are developed outside of Venice, but it's the Venetians who create the telescope, which can be used, or the printed book, which is developed, of course, by Gutenberg in Germany, becomes a commercial thing, the printed book in Venice, and Venice is a great city of printing. So one of the things that they do is create a kind of a partnership, and this is almost like the modern idea we have of a limited or a joint stock company. It's a partnership. It's not family-based, and this is a key difference, particularly with Jewish and Muslim principles, where it typically was members of a family, brothers, for example, and you use the family loyalty, as a way of ensuring that business was conducted properly. There were two problems with this. One is you were limited numerically with the size of the enterprise by the number of siblings, and secondly, of course, as we know from history, that siblings don't always behave honourably, and so there was no sort of legal backup, and so these enterprises could often end in strife. What the Venetians do is have a legally documented arrangement that's often between a senior and a junior partner, a silent partner, and the factor, the person who actually has to do the trading, who has to move with the goods. So typically the arrangement might be like this. The older merchant who was well established, didn't have to take so much risk, certainly didn't want to travel with the goods, wanted to sit enjoying the good life in his great palace in Venice. That person might put up, let's say, 80% of the capital or 75% of the money. A junior, adventurous, risk-taking merchant could borrow the other 25%, high risk with interest, would actually travel with the trading mission, which is a physical risk and consumes time, would supervise the movement of the goods, but should the trade mission be successful and the goods could come back to Venice and be sold, the income would then be split 50-50. So the older merchant who had provided a lot of the money only kept a smaller amount of the reward. The younger merchant, on the other hand, because he'd taken most of the risks, was up for a much bigger reward. And thus this system of colleganze created a dynamic system which could change generationally, which could move beyond the family structure, and which was backed up in law. The government, as well as providing laws and a system of justice, which supervised the commerce, also protected trade actively. And this is where the arsenale comes in the Venetian galleys and the navies. They had a permanent maritime presence, a permanent naval presence and strength, and they systematized and centralized the production of ships, and also the crewing of those ships, in a way that no other Mediterranean state was doing. And so there's a whole separate talk on shipping in the arsenal of Venice in this period. They also created laws which said that the Venetian ships had to travel out in convoys, so not the risky thing of a single boat which could easily be picked off by pirates. And then they develop the galley as a ship which was a rowed ship, which could be rowed as well as being sailed, and during times of engagement, military engagement, if there were pirates, could move very swiftly. The sailors who were on the galley were also trained soldiers, and thus the fleet could be protected through the always treacherous waters of the Mediterranean. If you think about moving goods in convoy, one of the risks is that when you come back with 10 ships and they've all got the same goods on them, that the market is flooded and the prices could go down. So the Venetians, through their state, develop collective control of prices. They talk to each other. The Venetian government allows or encourages the nobles to talk in one another. They warehouse goods. They warehouse both at the point of supply, so the trading station, so that goods are acquired slowly and built up. They use loans and other financial instruments in order to do that. And similarly, when the goods arrived in Venice, they're released slowly onto the market by agreement, so that the prices are maintained in that way. Part and parcel, and following on, how do you supply? Time is money, as we know. Well, part of the way that you can facilitate that warehousing of goods is to provide credit, good credit and easy credit. So international finance becomes important. So, for example, the letter of credit, which allows you to purchase in advance or purchase on credit goods, let's say in Constantinople, because there is a sale underway at that time in Venice that has produced revenue. So rather than merchants of old who actually had to carry the coin with them in exchange, you could have simply a letter of a credit. The banking system grows up in this way. Accounting is going to be necessary with 2 sets of books. So double entry accounting is another administrative system which is not invented in Venice, but really develops in Venice, so that there are entry and exit of records, and the books can be balanced and anomalies are investigated at various times. The use of rigid accounting, but also particularly letters of credit and things like that, and cheaper loans than other kinds of loans, has the effect of speeding up the movement of money. The physical movement of money through coin is very slow. You can double or triple the speed and therefore double or triple your returns if you've got letters of credit. So this means that you can actually lower slightly the profit if the money's moving through your books 3 times, and so you can be competitive and still make lots of money, more money than your competitors if you've got these innovations. Of course, there's no point in having a lot of regulation unless you've got the laws to back them up. And one of the frequent images of Venice that you see is one of justice governing the city. It's there. If one has a look at the entrance to the Doge's palace, you'll see in other kinds of sculptural decoration and state propaganda, you'll see representations of St. Mark, of course, the patron saint of Venice, whom I've talked about at length in another lecture. But you'll also see representations of Venice. Now, of justice. Now, Venice had a famous judicial system. It was administered by the Republic. The nobility served. There were 3 kinds of courts, a large number of justices. All of the trading agreements and the contracts were notarized. They were recorded and registered by an official of the state and stored, so that if anything went wrong with the arrangements, the legal system was there, the documentation was there, and the backup through prisons and even worse punishments was also enforced by the Venetians. So over time, Venice is not only an efficient place to do business from a point of view of the naval technology, of the fast movement of money, but it's also got the legal backing to make sure that when business is done, it will be done properly. So all of those things combined, they're all very often, if you like, soft or administrative or technological kinds of changes, but they all play their role in giving Venice this incredible advantage for its trade, and it's part of the reason why there's an explosion. And whilst other people are trading, the Venetians are succeeding in a way and on a scale that other places can only dream about. So a couple of examples now, and a beautiful illustration now for this slide of the diplomatic manipulation of commerce. So the Golden Bull, the one that I've mentioned. So having protected the trading convoys from the threat of the Normans in the southern Adriatic, the Venetians were able to trade tax-free. Now, taxes could be 10, 15, 20% at this time, so it's an enormous financial advantage to start away. That's a kind of way, ineffectively, of financially closing the doors to competitors. Another way to do so more directly is to enforce a monopoly, and the Venetians, thanks to their control of the shipping routes, principally, and the ports. They weren't free ports, they were controlled ports. And the Venetians controlled both the ships that came in and out of those ports, but also the people and the groups of people who could be traded. So they set up an exclusive relationship, for example, with the Turks, and prevented both Western competitors, such as the Genoese, but also other Eastern competitors, such as the Greeks, of trading directly. Sometimes those trading arrangements went into the mainland and well beyond Venice's own territories. So Milan, which was a growing trading place and an important duchy with a very big arms manufacturing industry. The Germans were very interested in doing business. They were forbidden by the Venetians, who insisted that the goods had to be moved through Venice, even though there were direct routes, of course, across the Alps into Germany in that way. So the Venetians, although it might have been a small cut and it might have been backed up with financial systems and justice, the Venetians got their pound of flesh even in the trade between Milan and Germany, for example. Another aspect of the Venetian commercial scene, though, that I would like to finish off this shorter talk on is to do with manufacturing. So the archetype of Venice is the Venetian merchant. Venetian commercial life is the Venetian merchant, and certainly commerce and the buying and selling of goods based on Oriental principles was extremely important in Venice. But another thing that we should not overlook is the idea that Venice was a major manufacturing city. Now, actually, if you look carefully around Venice, you will see lots and lots of evidence of manufacturing right through to the 19th and even the 20th century. So have a look, for example, across the Giudecca Canal, and the Hilton Hotel today on the island of Giudecca is housed in a former cotton mill, a vast 19th century cotton mill controlled by the Stuckey family. In earlier centuries, there were many other important things. So salt, I've mentioned, soap manufacture, which was based, and of course glass manufacture. Now, with both soap and glass, the Venetians used their trade networks to have superior ingredients. So the potash, which was used in both those products, came from as far as Syria. Most of the olive oil came from Puglia on the southern heel of Italy. So these were, the extent, for a start, the geographical extent, the miles that these commodities traded was far greater. But what they gave are superior ingredients that allowed, for example, the glass that came from Venice was superior in its quality and recognized as such, and therefore in demand, not just for decorative pieces, as Murano glass is today, but for very practical sorts of reasons, or for even for church decorations and things like that. So much so that I'm sure that you know that the secret, the process for producing glass in Venice was regarded as so important that the whole manufacturing was moved from the centre of Venice away to the islands to protect fire, but also to protect the patent, if you liked, on it. Another wonderful example from slightly later on of Venice as a manufacturing city comes in the form of printing. Now, I mentioned printing originally for the purposes of printing copies of the Bible, developed in Germany. The Venetians recognized the huge commercial property. So even by the first century of printing, Venice is rivaling Germany and then exceeding, so that by the end of the 16th century, 1/3 of the world's books are being produced in Venice. And you can see at the top of this slide an example of one of the most famous of the 200 odd print shops in Venice. This is the Aldine Press, Aldus Manutius. So many of the fonts that we know today, the print fonts that we use on our computers and things, were actually developed with movable type in Venice. The Aldine Press are typically Venetian symbol there with the anchor and the dolphin there. Venice, because of its distinct political position and particularly its independence from the church, as the 16th and the 17th century move on, become important for scientific knowledge. So the University of Padua, for example, which hosted Galileo in the early 17th century and published materials which were often in conflict with the church's teaching, and of course Protestant ideas eventually are also, and things like that could be printed safely in Venice and then exported. So a huge important trade. Even things to this day, such as furniture manufacturing, cloth, silk is another example where the Venetians kidnap silk workers from Lucca and create a monopoly. So equal to the trade then is the important area of manufacture. So a brief account there of the rise of Venice as a trading empire, and then towards the end there, some of the characteristics of Venetian commerce and of manufacturing. I hope this talk added to your understanding of Venice and your enjoyment of the city when you visit. Thank you very much.